First, I want to thank Alma Gildenhorn. This is part of the Gildenhorn book series. Thank you very much, Alma.
Thank
you. Whatever. And whoa, you drew a crowd.
We were talking about it's you, book Walter. Tour.
Yeah, no. There's nobody in this room who will say, I haven't seen enough of Walter yet. They have seen far too much of me. But it's a pleasure to have David Westin here. David represents the grand tradition of journalism. He and I sort of were in the business together. Somebody who knew how to deal with the moral issues of journalism, but also make it exciting and good. And this book has a real purpose, which is to keep that trajectory alive. This is a book that does some amazing things. It doesn't try to be gossipy. It doesn't try to settle scores. It tries to look at every issue, 7 or 8 of them, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. That you face, particular examples and what we can learn from them. So it's my great pleasure to have my old friend, David Westin.
Thank you so much, Walter.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Thank you all for coming.
Exit interview. First of all, what was your original reason for writing this book?
Well, as Walter knows, because he watched it, and it probably wasn't very pretty at times. My first job in journalism was running ABC News, which is not the normal way you go to a job like that. And I thought it would be interesting to people. I would have wanted to know this before I went, to get a glimpse inside the newsroom, particularly when there are big stories breaking, there are really big stories to cover, what goes into it. I mean, some of it really noble and really wonderful, some of it sausage being made, and I try to address both of those sides of it. And it was basically say, people ought to understand whether they criticize or praise. Before they criticize or praise, they should get some sense of what really goes on, and the great appreciation I came to have for journalists and what they do.
And you told me just now that in some ways your purpose in writing the book, as you talk about it now, somewhat shifted in a way. You have another purpose too.
No, that's right, because it's 8 or 9 stories about things like Princess Diana and 9/11 and 2000 election and the war in Iraq and what went on behind the scenes. But I realized as I thought about it and talked about it more, it became an important part of my purpose that this not just be nostalgic, that this not just be the past, because there's great journalism being done today the way I believe there was some great journalism being done when I got to be there. And it can continue into the future. And it's terribly important to me, having seen what goes into it and seen some of the beneficial effects it can have on our republic, that continue. And frankly, part of it is a little bit of a charge to the public, because it's not just up to the journalists what gets covered and how it gets covered, it's also up to the public. Because if you come to stories and come to great journalism, you'll get more of it. And unfortunately, the reverse also tends to be true.
Yeah. You had to follow a legendary guy who kind of overlapped with you, Roone Arledge. What was it like trying to learn from him, but also establish your own role?
Yeah, he was fascinating. I'm sure all of you know about Roone Arledge, but he created really ABC Sports first, wide world of sports. He really made the Olympics what they became, and a real legend in television in the 60s and 70s. And then into the 80s, he took over ABC News, and he came from outside journalism, outside news, and there was some skepticism about him as well at the beginning. And then he built ABC News from what they used to say was the 4th out of 3 network news organizations into a real powerhouse, to a real shining light. And I came in after that. And by the way, it's not a good idea as a career move to follow a legend, whatever you do. I mean, it was not my first choice.
And one of the people you had to deal with, I'll say, is Peter Jennings, who at first was skeptical, right? And how did you end up, there's one of the great tales in here, both the Princess Diana one, but the whole Peter Jennings saga.
Yeah, well, Peter was a journalist through and through, and as a journalist through and through, he was a skeptic first. And that skepticism applied to heads of state and presidents of the United States and newsmakers. It also applied to presidents of news divisions. And he was not shy about his skepticism. Let's be honest, many people in the newsroom were skeptical. And when I came in, I was somewhat surprised at the skepticism, because I thought I was a reasonable person. And I had worked with ABC News as the chief lawyer, as the general counsel on various matters. And I'd worked with him as head of the network. So I thought, well, they'll basically accept me, this will be fine. But in fact, there was a lot of skepticism. Peter was first among them, and he put me through my paces, as he did a number of us. I mean, Jackie Judd's here. I'm glad to see Jackie's here, but she could tell you. She's right back there. I'm so glad to see Jackie.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry, there's a light right above Jackie. I thought it was a halo.
Peter Jennings put us all through our paces in different ways over periods of time. And I'm delighted to say that over time, as we covered stories together and went through some difficult situations together, we became very close professionally and personally. But at the very beginning, he really had doubts about who I was, this corporate suit lawyer coming from the outside. What was my agenda? What was I doing with
But
his
he
news
also
division?
had doubts that, he was for real pure journalism, means eat your spinach and learn about me in Beirut, and that you might popularize it. And I think that came to a head the weekend Diana died.
Yeah, I was only 4.5 months into the job, so I was pretty new on the job. And you all may remember the Princess Diana event happened on a Saturday evening of Labor Day weekend at the end of '97. And so most people were away, or at least a lot of people were away, including Peter, and for that matter, Roon. So I went into the newsroom while the story was still breaking, sort of unfolding, and typically, as Walter knows so well, when those stories start coming, they go all over the map. You get all these conflicting reports, you don't know what's going on, and nothing adds up.
And you get so bogged down sometimes in the conflicting reports and details, it's hard to see the big picture, which is this a huge story, or are we making too much of it?
Yeah,
and that was the big issue on Saturday evening.
Yeah, it's exactly
the
right.
Time magazine where I was, as well as, yeah.
No, exactly. And I went into the newsroom, and one of the first decisions, besides figuring out who we had in London and Paris, particularly and back in New York, and what special interrupts we were doing in the network, one of the first decisions I made was to do a primetime special the next night if she was dead, because at that point it had not been confirmed she was dead. And so, in order to do a primetime special on television, it takes a lot of work. You have to bring in a lot of people, pull a lot of tape, do a lot of writing, do a lot of reporting, weave it all together. So we needed to start crashing. And Peter caught up with the story after the announcement had been made, well after the announcement had been made. And it was
After the announcement of the primetime special.
after the announcement of Princess Diana's death.
Death.
And we hadn't announced the special at that point, but he called in, and I took the call just off camera. We were in special report about 11:30 at night. And he said, David, I understand Princess Diana's died, and I understand you're considering a primetime special. And I said, that's right, Peter, I am. And Peter, in my experience, Peter did not raise his voice very often, because he didn't need to, but he could be very emphatic. You had no doubts about how he felt about something. And he said, David, that is your right. But I feel I owe it to you to tell you that if you do a primetime special on Princess Diana, no one will ever take you seriously as the president of ABC News. So here I am, 4.5 months in, and I've got Peter Jennings, the legend, and somebody who I personally had enormous respect for, saying, you are not just making a mistake, you're making a very big mistake on your first breaking news story. And I didn't have, Peter's 30 years or so of journalism at that point to draw on. I had my family. And so I said, Peter, I know she wasn't the head of state, but I have a sister back in Michigan, because I'm from Michigan. And she doesn't typically read tabloids, but she's read every detail of this woman's life since the moment she got engaged to Charles. And I think there are going to be other people who feel that way. He said, David, I said it's your right. I will have nothing to do with it. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation.
No, it wasn't the end of the conversation.
Well, he called me the next morning. By 10 o'clock, he was on the phone saying, David, I'm on my way in from out of town.
Wait. But if I remember correctly, at that point, you then decided to have Diane Sawyer and
the first thing I did was
Walters
you have to have an anchor for a special.
Right?
That's right.
Is it co-anchors?
Co-anchors, that's right. I recruited Diane Sawyer and Barbara Walters.
Because that's sort of a context of Peter calling back.
Well, it is. It is indeed the context. So I immediately arranged, and Diane and Barbara said, of course, we'll do it, no questions asked, we'll be in to do it. So next morning, Peter calls in first thing and says, David, I've looked at the coverage. You were right, I was wrong. It's a really big story, I want to do the special. And I said, well, Peter, you are our prime anchor, so of course you can do the special. But I now owe it to you to tell you that I've already got Diane and Barbara anchoring the special.
Which he probably knew.
That's a great question I never thought of. Maybe he did. He was a pretty good reporter, so he probably had scoped it out. But because he said, fine, I said, you have to do it with him. And he said, fine. And so what we did is we ended up putting on a 2-hour special on, because it was that big a story by that point. We had that much material. And it was co-anchored by Peter Jennings, Diane Sawyer, and Barbara Walters. And in doing the book, I went back and read the transcript and saw something I'd forgotten, which was almost at the top of the special. Peter turns to Barbara and Diane and says, when you first heard about this story, did you think it was that big a story? And Diane says yes, and Barbara says, "Oh my, yes." And then Peter just went on.
Had they been really great reporters, they would say, "And you,
Yeah,
Peter?
yeah, exactly.
What did you say to David Westin when
That's
you
right,
called?"
that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
But Peter was making an important point. I mean, he admitted he was wrong. And by the way, that line has moved. I mean, today, if that sort of story came up, I don't think anybody would raise questions in a newsroom. But there was a legitimate point he was raising, which is you have to think about these big stories. Why are you covering it? Is this major historical significance that we're covering here, or is this popular? And you can do both, but you need to really be thinking about why it is you're covering something.
And that was the whole point of this chapter, and I'll get on to a couple of the other chapters, is how do you balance what people will want to watch with what is true, important, worthy journalism? And how did you come out of that doing that balance or figuring out that line?
That was one of the hardest, if not the hardest things that I did, and also one of the most rewarding. Because I said during my time at ABC News, what our mission is to do the best journalism for the most people. And it's reasonably easy to do one of those things, to do really great journalism that nobody is particularly interested in, or to really reach a lot of people when it's really bad journalism. But when you can do both of them and get the intersection right is when it's great. And you could see in a given program or given report, sometimes it's slipping off a little bit one direction or the other. But that was, as I say, the most challenging and the most rewarding. I was not very sympathetic to people who were purists on either extreme. I was not sympathetic to people who said, we just do the journalism when we don't care about the audience. As I said to one of our senior anchors, not Peter, but one of our senior anchors once who said in a group, you shouldn't care about the ratings. I said, I don't feel that way, and you shouldn't either, because if you really don't care if anybody's paying attention to what you say, then you're not a journalist, you're keeping a diary. And there's nothing wrong with keeping a diary, but if you really believe in the importance of what you're saying, you should care how many people are paying attention to it. You should want to reach as many people as possible. But I also obviously was not sympathetic. People said we just go for the audience and don't worry about the journalism.
One of the great things about this book is you reflect on things, and sometimes you realize you were wrong. It's not typical of a memoir like this, which is why I was right and everybody else was wrong. And in one of those balances, I think you got it wrong, and that was the Leo DiCaprio interviewing the president one.
Yeah. For those of you who don't remember, I hope some of you don't remember, but
but it's in the book,
but
so
it's
I'll
in the
remind
book.
you.
No, I try to step up to it. ABC News ended up having Leonardo DiCaprio go to interview President Clinton for an environmental special. Now, it didn't start out there, and if somebody had come to me and said, do you want Leonardo DiCaprio to interview President Clinton, I would have said, no way. But what happened was we wanted to do a serious environmental special. Peter actually had done one about a year before, and nobody had paid attention to it. Someone came to me and said, Leonardo DiCaprio is the chairman of Earth Day this year, and he knows about the environment, and we think that we could get him to put an appearance in on the special, and that would help us get a larger audience. Now, you can think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it was trying to get a bigger audience for a serious special. And then I went off and did other things, the Millennium Program, and we were covering the presidential election and things like that. And next thing I knew, I got a call that said, well, we just thought you should know that Leonardo DiCaprio is on his way to the White House. And I said, whatever for? What is he going to the White House for? He said, well, he's going to talk to President Clinton for the special. And I said, what do you mean he's talking to President of the United States about the special? I thought he was going to come out at the top and say something about Earth Day. And they said, well, don't worry about it. It's not really an interview. It's not a formal interview.
Yeah, always in trouble when that phrase happens. It's not really an interview.
Exactly. And I blew this. I didn't see it. I should have seen it. And they said, no, it's just going to be sort of a walk around to sort of talk about things they've done at the White House to be more environmentally correct, like triple pane glass and things like that. And I said, well, I don't love it, but I guess if it's just going to be walking around, it's okay. Next thing I know, I get a call and says, well, they've just had the press briefing at the White House and have disclosed that the president spent part of his day talking with Leonardo DiCaprio for ABC News. And I said, well, but it wasn't an interview. He said, no, that was a sit-down interview. And I said, what do you mean? I was told that that's what it wasn't. I said, well, no, the White House insisted once they got there. So it was a mess. It blew up. A lot of our people, anonymously, but understandably, said this is ridiculous. I mean, what is going on?
There's nothing easier than get an anonymous journalist on a high horse, and you got a lot of them on it.
And I did. Yeah. And I took my licks. And I made the matter worse by taking what I'd been told about what had happened and defending it and really fighting for it. And it turns out it was all wrong. It turns out that there was a producer that had pitched it as a sit-down interview from the beginning. And I knew I was in big trouble when Leonardo DiCaprio was quoted as saying that he'd been prepared by ABC News to do the sit-down interview. And so I just had egg all over my face. But listen, there was an important point there, which is journalists, first of all, are very sensitive about these issues. They really guard what they do jealously. The lines between a journalist and a non-journalist have gotten blurred. Even up to that point, they were blurred, and now they've gotten blurred far more with the internet and social media and things like that. And the fact is, there is a difference. I mean, I got to work with Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer and people like that in preparing for interviews, and it's not just going in and asking questions. I mean, there's real expertise and experience and reporting and work and skill and craft that goes into these, and you just can't ask anybody to go do an interview, and I blew it. I admit it.
You say the lines have gotten blurred, though. Is there still a bright line between who's a journalist and who isn't? I'm
not sure there was ever a terribly bright line between who is and who isn't. But whatever line there was, I think it's gotten more blurred because anybody can have access to the world instantaneously. You don't need a printing press. You don't need a television network anymore. You can tweet something and it goes around the entire world. I do think that there is a line, but the line is often left to the public to define. I mean, it really is up to the public to decide who really knows what they're talking about and who doesn't, and who is really trying to get it right and who is spinning. And a lot more pressure, I think, has been put upon the audience with the developments in news, where at this point we all have to be our own editors to some extent.
Well, should there be more of a line, or is this a good thing?
I think it's impossible to have more of a line because actually I had this question from someone. Law, you have to take boards, right? You have to take the bar exam.
They're real professions.
Medicine, dentistry, accounting, everything else. Yeah. Well, but to some extent, the First Amendment makes it awfully hard to do that way. Right. I mean, you can't. All of those have some degree of government involvement or government regulation. I wouldn't want to live in the United States of America that had the government start defining who is a journalist and who isn't. So if you don't have the government define it and have some ultimate government sanction for it, how does that get defined? And so it ultimately gets left up to the people. So whether it would be nice to have it or not, I don't personally see a way around it.
But as a lawyer, there is a First Amendment issue. I mean, I'm faced with certain things, in my Steve Jobs reporting, let me say. And, people want to say, well, I'm a journalist, this is the rights I have. And it's a little hard now to assert shield rights, and this stuff you dealt with all your career, but, the shield laws, First Amendment laws, do they now apply to anybody who's tweeting?
That was one of the, everybody know what a shield law is? A shield law basically gives some protection to journalists not to reveal confidential sources when a court wants to discover them. And the laws in, I think it's 49 states, either common law or by statute, give some protection to journalism. There's no federal protection at all, none. And so there have been proposals to have a federal shield law that I came down and testified in favor of and talked with senators and congressmen about and things like that. And I personally think it would make sense for there to be a federal rule. Having said that, in talking, particularly with one senator, in detail about this, the senator said, well, wait a second. How do we know that these people really have their sources? And shouldn't we include in the law certain abilities to regulate sources and confidential sources? And I thought, wait a second.
Let's not open that can.
Exactly. So when you ask for favors from the government like that, often there's a quid pro quo that's not very comfortable.
Speaking of the government like that, you and I both went through the process of 9/11 and what I think I called at one point the patriotism police, which came back and haunted me. But the question of the role of journalism in a time of national patriotism.
We did go through it together. And by the way, I should say, Walter encouraged me on this book before it existed and after it existed. And
we lived on the same road many years with Sherry?
Yeah,
in the way back? Yes. In Bronxville. And,
But we did go through that together. And I mean, obviously covering 9/11 itself was harrowing. It was terrible and tragic and shocking and things. But there was that other element whether you call it patriotism police or something else, that kicked in pretty early on. And
explain what it was.
Well, in my experience, it came in two probably interrelated ways. The first wave of it actually came from the White House itself. Because pretty early on, if not on 9/11, by 9/12, we were getting feedback from the White House. We at ABC News in particular, I talk about this in the 9/11 chapter, we were getting real criticism from the White House about some of the ways we were covering the event. And most specifically on 9/11, if you recall, President Bush gave some remarks down the floor and then said, I'm going to go back to Washington now. And he didn't go back to Washington for security reasons, good and sufficient. You know, they flew in Air Force One to 2 different Air Force bases before he got back in the evening. Peter, as part of our ongoing coverage, said, you know, we haven't heard again from the President. This is a time it's important to hear from the President. He said, every time he discussed it, presumably they think there are security issues, you can't do it. At the same time, it's really important. This is a time the President really stuff. The White House took this really badly. They took it as criticism of the White House, and they were on the phone, if not 9/11 by 9/12, letting us know we were in trouble with the White House. So first we got it from the White House, and we got some of it with requests about restricting some reporting.
Well, we were on a phone call, if I remember. I think it was National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice at the time. She wasn't secretary yet. On bin Laden tapes. If you remember, bin Laden was releasing tapes, and we were putting them on the air. And the government didn't want that for 2 or 3 reasons. They said one reason was, oh, there might be encoded or things, and you know, that tell what to do. But also they, I don't think, wanted it because they didn't want the propaganda or the views of the of bin Laden and his people aired that way. And they got us all on a conference call and asked us to hold back a bit. And you were one of the leaders of that. Yeah. I was on that call, and I'm saying, wonder what David's about to say.
Oh, no, I doubt that. But throughout that, that was a specific instance. There were other specific instances. I had a point of view that of 2 things. First of all, when it came to the banana tapes, we asked, okay, specifically, what do you think they might be doing? Is it hand gestures? What is something that we can address? They had no specifics. They could come up with no specifics. We just think there might be something in there. And in listening to it for the propaganda person, I thought, do you really think the American people are going to listen to this person and what he's saying and say, oh boy, that's a really good idea, I really agree with him? I thought there was, and the worst thing I thought at that time, from 9/11 through Afghanistan into Iraq, and I said this to the White House a couple times, but they had none of it. I said, the worst thing you can do for national security purposes right now is to make the American people suspect that there are things that the media is agreeing with the White House not to report. Because then people are going to wonder, okay, what else am I not knowing? What else are you keeping from me? So you know, you can have your point of view, we'll listen to your point of view. For us to get together and agree not to report some things, I thought was a bad idea from their point of view. They were not sympathetic to that viewpoint. But the other source of the patriotism police was the audience itself, at least some parts of the audience. It wasn't just the White House. I mean, we had, again, on 9/12 or so, we had questions from the print press about whether we would wear American flag lapel pins, because some of the cable people were doing it and they were putting flags in their sets and all sorts of things. And we'd had a long-standing policy not to wear any kind of lapel pin, just on the theory that when you're reporting the news, you should be perceived as just reporting the news, not affiliated with anyone. And I frankly was concerned that given the fact that all the administration people, whenever they appeared, had that flag lapel pin on, it would look like maybe we're an adjunct of the administration. You can think that's a right decision or wrong decision, reason why it's different, but I stuck with it. I got killed. I mean,
no, I stuck with it too, and both of us. I had Lou Dobbs, who wouldn't. I was at CNN at the time, and Lou Dobbs put it on and wouldn't. It was a problem. I finally, and you had
Terry Moran, a great reporter. He was a White House reporter at the time. He's on Nightline now, and actually, I saw Terry on the air, and I called down to Robin Sproul, our bureau chief, and I said, get that lapel pin off. And she said, you got a real problem. You got to talk to Terry about it. And so I got on the phone with Terry, and I have enormous respect for Terry, a really smart, really good reporter. And we went at it emphatically. Was that the word I used about Peter? I mean, we went at it emphatically with each other at some length, building up to Terry saying, David, I'm a journalist, but I'm American first. And I said, Terry, you are both an American and a journalist, and your highest patriotic duty right now as a journalist is to report to the American people. That's what the American people need you to do as a patriot. And I'm glad to say he backed down, not because I was right, but because I needed him.
You call Lou Dobbs.
Oh, yeah. I think that's probably a tougher one than Terry Moran, I suspect.
I won't go there. Yeah, and the other thing, though, was, I mean, I was facing, and you were to some extent, Fox and others criticizing those journalists who weren't putting the flag up, weren't following, you know, a more patriotic, as they would put it, line.
Yeah, Roger Ailes was not shy about calling me on this very directly, and that how could I not want an American flag pin on? So that's absolutely right. I mean, Fox is a phenomenon we watched grow together. When I first started in March of '97, Fox News and MSNBC were only 2 or 3 months old. They were in their infancy. And at the time, we thought, naively, and this is Roon and I, thought, why is there room for 2 more CNNs? I mean, why is there room for 2 more sort of 24-hour straight news coverage channels? We didn't realize that Fox News, and then later followed to some extent by MSNBC, had a different theory. They were going to take polemics and put it together with the news in a very powerful cocktail that, from a business point of view, has been enormously successful, because although their audience is not nearly as big as people think it is, good enough, but not as big as you think it is deeply engaged. The people go to Fox and they stay there and they come again and again and again. And in the new cable world, where you rely upon subscription money as much or more than you do advertising, that deep engagement allows you to charge a lot of money for your channel and make a lot of money. It's a brilliant business model. I mean, I think if you don't keep the line between opinion and fact straight, I think it's bad for the country. But it's a brilliant business model.
Well, you talk about business models. I think you end the book with having to lay people off and the question of, is this sustainable?
I do. One of the things I came to believe very strongly was that if you don't believe in the business of journalism, you don't really believe in the journalism. Because in order to do the journalism, you need the money to invest in the reporters and the beats and the sort. You really need to invest a lot of money. It's expensive to do good journalism. So if you don't figure out a way to pay for that, then sooner or later the journalism will wither and die. And I concluded, given all the changes that happened in the marketplace, in the audience size, and also in what technology made possible, that in order for ABC News to really have a strong and robust future going forward, indefinitely, I really needed to change ABC News fundamentally. We took about 25% of the organization away, which was terrible. I mean, terrible first and foremost for the people who had to leave. We tried to be as generous and as reasonable as possible, but it was awful for all of us to say goodbye to wonderful people. But the important point is, whether you think I was right or wrong, and I still believe to this day it was the right thing to do for ABC News. It was not fun, it wasn't good for my reputation, but it was the right thing to do for ABC News. Whether you agree with it or not, I think it's just critically important that these news organizations figure out ways that they can sustain themselves in the future. So, going back to what you talked about before, this is not just history, that this continues into the future, and we keep having reporters who really do great original reporting, and we sustain that.
Well, I can say without qualification that you left ABC News the strongest news division, and whether it was, you know, smart things you did with George Stephanopoulos, or, you know, Diane, or the way you handled, you had the particular difficult issue of handling the anchor of your evening news when Peter died and then Bob Woodruff was hurt. You handled those things with great grace, but also ended up with stronger newscasts and stronger people in each position.
Well, thank you. I'd like to believe that's true, but thank you.
And my last question before I open it up, you talk about the future. For the past couple of years, you've been dealing with the digital rights issue with something called news rights, which I think sprang out of the Associated Press. But it's a question of what is the business model, or one of your core questions is, what is the business model going to be in an era when the internet sort of aggregates and takes everything we do? How do you see that working both in video and in print?
Well, what I'm doing now is a direct outgrowth of what I just talked about sustaining journalism in the future. And I was on the Associated Press board for about 9 years as their sort of token broadcast person. And so they came to me and said, help the newspaper companies, including the Washington Post, Steve Hills is here, and New York Times and McClatchy and Hearst, and the Associated Press, get this new company up and running. The good news is this. Number one, people are spending more time consuming news and information than ever before. They can get it more ways. So the overall demand for news is going up. It's not going down. That's a good thing. Okay? People can get it every way, everywhere, all the time. Another piece of good news is an awful lot of what people end up consuming, even on the internet and social media, ultimately comes from some really good reporters. most often, frankly, newspapers, if you go, area by area, but also television. But it also, ultimately, an awful lot of it doesn't originate with an internet company, actually originates with more mainstream media. That's the good news, and we should all embrace that and rejoice in it. The issue that we need to address is, because of what the internet makes possible, people can consume it without going to the website of the people who invest in the reporters. They can get it some other way because it gets passed around. And what we're trying to do is figure out sensible ways that we can license into that area so that some of that money can come back to the people paying the reporters, so we can keep having money to pay reporters.
It's like the old ASCAP system.
Yeah, exactly. It's related to ASCAP. That's exactly right.
Where music gets played on free radio. But all right, open it up, please. Discussions, comments. Jackie, make you start first.
Jackie, but I have to say, I'm delighted to see Jackie Judd here, because Jackie was the core of our reporting on the President Clinton impeachment.
Yeah.
And broke the story and was a great
there's
reporter.
a chapter on that in the book.
There is a chapter.
Which I'm sorry we didn't get into, but maybe Jackie will lead us there.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see you, David, and I appreciate what you wrote in the book. I don't like the picture, though.
Oh,
of you? I know, it's a terrible picture. By the way,
it's a terrible picture.
You know, you should talk to my wife, because we don't like any of the pictures, and I was supposed to be able to look at the pictures, and something happened with the publisher, and they didn't run any of those parts. It's a terrible picture.
That's
I'm sorry,
okay.
Jackie. But it's not the only terrible picture.
That's true.
Peter
I do have
Jennings
company
is
on that.
worse. Yeah.
And I do want to thank you publicly, David, for the support that you always gave me and my team, publicly and privately, during a really difficult period. It made all the difference.
That's good of you. You deserve it.
Thank you. But what I'd like to ask you is, pundits every now and then say in 5 years there will be no evening news. So having been out of the business for the years that you have, I'm wondering when you look at the model now, can it survive? Will there be an evening news in 5 years?
Well, great question. The direct answer is I don't know. I mean, one of the things I learned is my ability to predict is really limited. Anything I would have predicted in '97 probably would have been wrong, over the next 14 years. Now, two things I'll say about that is, number one, I originally went to Capital Cities ABC, the parent company ABC, in February of '91, so over 20 years ago now. The first week I was there was a discussion about whether the evening news would go away. Right. So, and that's over 20 years ago now. So it's been a lot more resilient than people give it credit for, and I think for some good reason. Even today, in any given night, world news has 7 or 8 million people watching it, and that's not 15 million, but it's also a lot bigger than any other single alternative. I mean, it's
and the combined cable news networks. Totally combined, or half that at that moment.
Exactly. So it's still, is a pretty powerful deliverer. I also think the reason they have that sort of audience is there is an appetite for sort of a well-produced, well-thought-through, scripted, edited synopsis of the day's news. And so I think that there's some room for that. That said, since I left ABC News, I consume an awful lot more on the internet than I ever did before. I don't watch as much. I watch. But I don't watch as much as I did. And so an important part of the future of these organizations, which they're all pursuing, and it's difficult because nobody knows exactly how it plays out, is figuring out how to take that great material that's created for a world news, for example, and make it available in a lot of other ways and get some money for that. Because obviously there's a lot more sources, and you need to go to all those sources with whatever output you have. But if I were going to guess 5 years from now, I bet there's still evening news.
Why can't I just go to my iPad at 7:45 and watch Diane Sawyer's World News? I subscribe to Comcast. I get my internet from Comcast, but I can't click on it and watch the news. I gotta watch it when Comcast puts it on at 6:30.
So I've been out of it for about 15 months now, so I don't know where it stands. The struggle we always had was geo-targeting and being able to limit it, because if you do that, it's before the West Coast gets to see it. And it's what it was an issue we always had with the affiliates. Mm-hmm. The affiliates were always concerned about that. Because as you know, television networks don't directly reach anybody. They go through local affiliates for everything. So you have to get them to take. So that was always the argument.
Now go through cable companies, which control them in a way.
Well, and maybe the new arrangements led by Comcast and things, where if you have a cable subscription you can sign on, maybe that will take care of that problem.
Yes, back there.
You spoke about Fox and MSNBC, and increasingly we see that people's concerns and issues and opinions are being reinforced by the media they choose, and it's becoming increasingly segmented. I'm one of those that believes that America's best days are ahead of us, but I look back and think about the moon landing, and I think of all those great things where we had one unifying voice in Uncle Walter or Huntley Brinkley providing us a national perspective and a unifying vision that was exciting and took us forward. And I'm very much concerned about the divided voices and the divided cacophony that we hear. I hope there's a continuing voice for the national news at night, but I'm very much concerned that part of the cacophony that we are hearing in the elections and in so much of our discourse right now speaks to the fact that we are choosing media that reinforce our narrow views rather than expand them.
Well, that's I agree with you completely that is the risk. I don't think it's necessarily the certain future, but that's the risk that we'll all just reconfirm one another's prejudices, basically, and we'll go find whoever has our prejudice. And that is a danger, and it's a risk in that what I think I saw during my time of an increasing degree of opinion and strident opinion, sometimes parading as news, not just on TV but on the internet and things, and I think that's a real risk. Now the counterweight to that is I do think that news organizations, significant news organizations, owe it to the audience to continue to give them a range so that they can choose, so that we don't just program for what we think they want, but also bring them to some things they don't want. My experience at ABC News, by the way, is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes we'd be pleasantly surprised when we'd put on something we thought was just important and no one would be interested, and we actually got a pretty big audience, which was a great experience, and that happened. So I think you have an obligation to put on a range of things, but then ultimately, and this is a version of what I was saying before, ultimately the people are going to decide. And if they want a range of reporting and they want to come to sort of a centrist view about the world, they can still have their opinion, but to come to that, then they have to reward it with their time and attention. If they do, you'll get more of it. If everybody does choose up sides, then these organizations will respond to that. So to some extent, it's not just up to them, it's up to us too.
Got it. You're next.
David, thanks. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I want to take you back to an earlier part of the conversation with Walter, because you have this dual track that you've developed of being a serious practicing lawyer and then a journalist. And I'll ask the question pretty simply, and that has to do with sources and their whether they are protected or not, shield law, et cetera. But the specific I want to ask you about is whether you think in the Scooter Libby, Time Magazine, New York Times, Judy Miller, Norm Pearlstein, et cetera, did Pearlstein make the right decision?
Oh, great question. Everyone knows what he's talking about, right? Now, Norm Pearlstein made a decision, and it was Time Magazine, wasn't it? It was Matt Cooper, exactly right. Basically to cooperate rather than to go to jail. I'll say two things about that. One is, at the time, I was sympathetic in this sense. It's one thing for an individual to decide, I'll go to jail, and frankly, I would think about this. I'm sure you thought about it from time to time. You know, in what circumstance would I say, you know, I'll be held in contempt of court and I'll fight this out and stick it out? It's another thing for a publicly traded corporation to get a criminal conviction against them. I mean, that's not just up to you. That's not just your life. That's your shareholders, and you have certain responsibilities. So I was always sympathetic to Norm and his predicament on that, because he was in a slightly different position. The other thing I think, you know, I learned from experience, I think this is probably after I left Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering down the street here, but one thing is, you have to decide at the outset whether this is a fight you really are willing to go all the way on or not. What are the stakes? How big are they? The worst thing you can do is take it halfway down and then concede. If you're going to concede, concede early and get out of it. Because if anything, you increase the attention paid, you increase the precedential effect on prosecutors around the country about what do I do if I go after those people. So, and it's not an easy call to make, but I think you really need to pick your battles when it comes to that. Now, I think a beneficial effect, actually, of that entire incident, if there could be one, certainly I can say within ABC News, is we tightened down on those sorts of promises of confidentiality. I mean, we'd always, I think, tried to be pretty tight, but we had, you know, I had to know about it. If somebody was agreeing that we were going to put the whole company in jeopardy, I needed to know about it. I do think that sometimes journalists might have been giving out those confidential promises a little too lightly and imprecisely. When you say, okay, it's a confidential source, what does that mean? Does that mean you're willing to go to jail rather than reveal me? Or does it mean something else? And I think that that's a beneficial effect, actually, of that whole series of events.
Thank you, Janice Gregory. I'd like to go back to at the beginning when you were talking about putting a story out that is an important story but nobody's going to listen versus the other extreme, putting stuff out that really isn't all that important but definitely gets viewers. And let me just take an example, violence. Almost everything I've seen by a serious study says that since the Middle Ages, violence in the world has been on a steady downward trend. So that the world we live in today is actually far less violent than the world of the Middle Ages. I don't think anybody walking down the street that would ever cross their mind. And you know, whether it's if it bleeds, it leads, or whatever, violence sells.
That's a good point, David.
And so how do you, you know, things like that, how do you, because it affects the society is at the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, very good point. And I can just tell you what we tried to do, how we tried to deal with those sorts of issues. The fact is, you know, a big violent event is news. You don't sort of not cover that because of it. What we did try to do, and we talked about this often in the newsroom, is, okay, can you give it in some context? How often does that happen? You know, how likely is it to happen? To give it some context. You know, this happened actually just after you left Time magazine in Iraq with the Where Things Stand series, because if you recall when the senior UN official, DeMayo, remember, was killed in the bombing?
DeMayo,
Yeah, remember that? Killed in the bombing of the UN headquarters. I was watching, it was horrific, and we did a special report. But I called some of our people together, and I said, you know, this is absolutely horrific, and we're covering these bombings in Iraq. I have no idea how broad this is in the country. I don't know whether this is going on everywhere, only a few places. You know, I don't know. So we started doing a series, we did several of them, with Time magazine, where we would go out and do a survey of Iraq on not just the violence, but also, you know, delivery of basic services, and is the government up and running, and is the water running, is the electricity running, to try to give a snapshot to put it in context. So I think the only good answer, and it's not to say we succeeded, but we tried to do, was when we had those incidents to put them in a broader context so that people just don't think this is going to happen to me if I walk down the street.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Kani Zulam. I'm with the American Kurdish Information Network. On December 28, 2011, an American drone informed the Turkish military of a caravan in the mountains of Kurdistan between Iraq and Turkey. 2 Turkish F-16 fighter planes took off and bombed 39 villagers and their mules. 34 died on the spot. 18 were kids. 1 was 12 years old. 27 had the same last name. I know this is not Princess Diana dying. I felt at the time drones were American, F-16s were American. In other words, there was an American angle to the story. Now that you have had time to reflect, what do the stories tell you or us about our state of humanity? Is it on the rise or is it on the decline?
Well, let me answer the last part first, and then I'll come back to the first part. This is just my personal attitude. I'm very skeptical of these trends up or down. I think history sort of goes up and down, it goes in cycles, and we tend to, by the way, in the media we tend to do this sometimes, try to prove everything's getting better or everything's getting worse. And in fact, it sort of goes up and down. And so I'm just skeptical about, I wouldn't answer a question, is it getting better or is it getting worse? You know, it's both is the answer. I, sitting here today, don't remember the story of Kurdistan with the Turkish fighters. I mean, if I knew it at the time, I didn't know it. It sounds like a terrible incident. Well, I mean, certainly we covered the Kurdistan issues along that southern Turkey border in northern Iraq. I mean, that was a recurring issue. And I know that's a very significant issue in that part of the world, but I'm at a loss. I just don't know. I don't remember knowing about it at the time or making a decision, whether it should be in the evening news or not. Sorry.
Mike Anderson. Do you think the American public is getting enough international news from either the mainstream networks or other sources like CNN, BBC, etc.? And I raise this question because I was brought up at a time when ABC did fabulous international news coverage of
It was called
Vietnam,
World News.
the Philippines, etc.
Yeah, it was called World News for a reason. Yeah, exactly. And by the way, Peter was an important part of that. I mean, that broadcast ended up being built around Peter, and he'd, of course, been bureau chief in Lebanon for quite a few years and then in London, and he had that world perspective that he brought, not just on the air, but behind the scenes editorially, that we missed when he was gone. He would bring in stories that otherwise we might not hear about, things like the Kurdistan story you referred to. Getting enough. It goes up and down. I mean, at the time of the Iraq War and Afghanistan and things like that, most people knew what a Sunni and a Shia was, and I never thought that the United States citizens would be familiar with that. I mean, it depends on what the news is. We spent millions upon millions of dollars. I personally like international coverage. I lived in London a couple of years with my law firm in the early 80s. And when we moved back, I was appalled that it was just impossible to get the kind of coverage I got every day when I was in London. Part of that's historical, I personally think. I mean, this has been a big country that has tended to look inward for expansion. England, for example, has been a trading company its entire history, essentially, so it's more outward looking. But I do think this, given the internet and given what technology makes possible, there's more available. It may not all end up in the evening news, but that's true for the BBC, for example. I use the BBC website all the time, and we can see BBC
I was about to say,
programming
BBC
here.
News is broadcast every night now
Yeah.
in Washington and in most cities of the United States.
And NPR
so
puts it on,
is,
too.
Russia Today and,
Yeah,
Al Jazeera. So I think we get more than, it's up to us to want to watch it, but it's more available now than
Exactly, and even within ABC News, about 3 or 4 years ago, we expanded our international coverage by taking journalists who were really talented people and sending them out as so-called one-man bands who could shoot their own material and relay it on the internet and edit it and things to locations that we had not been to. We not have regular positions in, like Jakarta and Nairobi. And no, but it's available on the internet. The reason we did it was to stream it on the internet. So that was the original reason we did that, was to stream it on the internet, so that if people wanted to get at it, they could get at it and make it available. But listen, I personally come from a place that I suspect is more like yours, which is I love international coverage. I like more, but it depends on what the audience wants to come to.
I'm just curious what you think of the photojournalism of Jon Stewart and Colbert.
Well, John, first of all, I enjoy it. And I appreciate it, because with their humor they can get at some central truths that it's harder to get to with a reporter in front of a camera. John would be the first one, if he were here, to say, I'm not doing journalism. I mean, he's pretty emphatic about that. He said, I am not a journalist. Maybe because he doesn't want some of the constraints that we suffered. But listen, I think you can get at certain underlying truths pretty quickly and effectively with some of that parody. And particularly, I mean, I think we all are taken by Jon Stewart's staff's ability to find video, that directly contradicts what somebody said yesterday. I mean, the stuff that they juxtapose, I mean, that's a wonderful form of truth-telling. To say, yeah, they said that now, 3 years ago, look at what they said. I think that's very effective.
very frightening.
Yeah, it is frightening, exactly. Yeah,
Susan?
that's what we're going to use here. Susan, thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure. I just want to thank you, David, for your outstanding leadership and for a book that really shines a spotlight on some of these very pivotal, complex moments and case studies, really, I think, for all of us to learn from. I just wanted to follow up on some of the other questions about, if you think about 1996, there was only dial-up phones in every house and no broadband access in homes. So the information age has totally revolutionized how we work and play, get our entertainment and news. In terms of the demographics, do you have any information, I mean, with convergence of the internet and the news, with apps, as Walter was saying, I mean, what do we know about how people are getting their news, both national and global? in terms of broadcast, in terms of the internet, in terms of their phones and so forth?
Yeah, what I know, and Walter, you may know as much or more than I do about this, is there's research pointing every direction, basically. I mean, the basic received wisdom a few years ago was internet goes younger, television goes older, print goes older, right? But then we started seeing at ABC News when I was there, the median age of abcnews.com starting to creep up as older people started to come online. It never made it up to the same median age as the programs, but it was, you know, it was up into the 40s or so when it started in the 20s or low 30s. So I think there's been an aging of some of that. There's also some research that's just been out in the last month or so that some of the younger, the 18 to 24-year-olds, some of them are getting more from, for example, newspapers than we had thought. So my sense is it's all over the map. What I really think is going on is, let me go back and reveal, I'm old enough to remember the first time I saw color television, you know, and it was like revolutionary. But within a reasonably short period of time, everybody had a color television. That's not the way it works anymore. Not everybody goes anywhere. Everybody goes everywhere, right? So that whether you're young or older, it depends on where you are and what time of day it is and what else you're doing. You may be watching television. You may, yes, be reading a newspaper or magazine. You will certainly be on the internet. You may be tweeting. You may be on Facebook and things like that. And so it's a splintering. But the other thing that I think is a concern that we just have to work hard at trying to overcome is what speed has done. Because things can go around the world in a nanosecond now before anybody gets to correct it. You saw this was it last week with the Syrian photo that ended up on the BBC home web page. I don't know if you saw this, but it got tweeted around. It was around globally. BBC picked it up. This BBC put it on their home site, and the photographer called up and said, by the way, I took that photograph. It was in Iraq, and it was 10 years ago. So that's part of the danger, because it's great because you get information instantaneously and it's a lot more access to it, which is terrific. Correcting it and vetting it is a big challenge for all of us that we didn't have years ago.
And I think your point about globalization is so critical to the news and to everything.
Yeah, it is. It is.
The one point I'd add to that is it's not only where are people getting the news. I mean, even if I had to think about it, I went online, Washington Post, and I go to Huffington Post or whatever it may be. It's where did that news originate, which is something you mentioned earlier. And when people, like my daughter, say to me, oh, I get my news on Google News, I say, who does Google News have in Iraq? You know, who do they have reporting things? And so we should also look at what was the source of the original reporting and try to find ways that they get rewarded, which is what you've been doing for the past 2 years.
That's right.
Yes. Two in the back there, one at a time.
David, can you talk about the interface between earnings and news?
Earnings?
Earnings and news, yeah.
And right behind you, if you will, yeah.
We were part of the Walt Disney Company, originally Capital Cities, and then it got sold before I went to news. And the Walt Disney Company is a for-profit enterprise. You know, it's publicly traded, and I felt a responsibility to return some operating income to the company, partly because that's our responsibility to the shareholders, partly because I understood, and I'm absolutely sure of this, that if I were returning operating income of a reasonable amount, it's not ESPN, let's be clear, right? It's not huge, but still a reasonable amount. I would have more autonomy to make decisions. When we had to cover 9/11, which cost an enormous amount of money and lost advertising as well as out-of-pocket expenses, when we had to cover the war in Iraq, you know, millions upon millions of dollars, I never had to go to anybody to ask for permission. I was trusted to do that. Now I had to manage my budget, but that was all on my head, and I got to do that. I always believed that if we ever went to a point where we were losing a lot of money as a company, I would have to be vetting things through people on the West Coast a lot more carefully. So I did not resist that at all. I think that that's part of what it takes to do really great journalism is figure out, and it's really hard, it's gotten harder, figure out ways that you can still return a reasonable amount of money to the shareholders and do great journalism. And that is going back to a version of what I said to Walter. It was the great challenge and the great reward. Because if you can do those two things, it feels really good.
Henry Luce in his will, when he talked about Time Magazine, said it would have two different missions. One was to return a buck to the shareholders, and the other was to do a public service. And he said, I always want people smart enough at the place to know that you can try to do both those things.
Exactly.
That it's easy to just say my one mission is to do journalism but not care. And then also in answer to Jackie's question or anything else, if the question is, will there be evening newscasts and nightlines 10 years from now? Yeah, if ABC News is making money, there will be, and if ABC isn't, there won't be.
Exactly right.
And you really can't get around that too much.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yes, we've heard mention of the network news, cable news, and even BBC and NPR. I just want to give a quick shout out to the PBS NewsHour, which also has an amazing website. But you also mentioned Roone Arledge and Diane Sawyer and Barbara, et cetera, Peter Jennings. Anything about, any good stories about Ted Koppel?
Ted Koppel and the reading off of the dead, isn't that in the
Well, that's a chapter, and it has to do with bias, actually, is the broader point. Ted and his executive producer, sadly departed now, Leroy Sievers, came to me about a year into the war in Iraq and said, we want to do an entire program at Nightline just reading off the names of the American service people who've given their lives. Because we're concerned, at that point, step back, in early 2003, in the build-up to the Iraq War, in the early days of the Iraq War, huge audiences. Everybody wanted to pay attention to it, right? 3 or 4 months into that war, people started running away from it. Anytime you put it on the air, you could not get the audience to pay attention. Now, we felt an obligation to do that, and that's part of what Where Things Stand came out of, was trying to figure out a way to get the audience to pay attention. But Ted's basic point, which I thought was exactly right, was you can think this is a good idea that we're there, you think it's a bad idea, but we should not be fighting a war where the American people are not coming to terms with the costs, not just in money, but in the young men and women who are giving their lives. And we did this sort of a ripoff of it was Life, right?
Life magazine.
Life magazine.
In Vietnam
it was a week in
1968.
Vietnam, right, in '68. And by the way, when we first talked about it, we knew that that's what we were doing, a version of that. But we thought we owed it to the public to do it. And we did it commercial free. It went 40 minutes or so longer than the usual Nightline. You know, we thought it might get some attention. That's why we're doing it. We got people coming down on us from the right of center very forcefully, and we ended up with a dinner where I sat next to Karl Rove, which I talk about in the book, where just before the thing aired. And Karl was really criticizing us about what we were about to do. And I said, well, Karl, assuming Fox News did exactly what we're doing, every word, every picture exactly the same, would it be different? He said, entirely different. And I said, well, why is that if it's exactly the same? He said, because everybody knows Fox News is not against the war, and everybody knows you're against the war. I said, well, in fact, I'm not against the war, but I mean, how do we function in a world like that? But Ted, the other thing about Ted is, Ted came to me in the build-up to the war and said, I want to be embedded. And I said, you must be joking. You know, one of our major anchors, let's be frank, of a certain age, and I'm going to risk you out there on the front lines? That's just crazy. And he and Leroy persuaded me this is something really important to them. They trained, they put rocks in a rucksack and marched up and down the canal to get in shape and things like that. And they went over there, bless their hearts, for about 3 weeks with the 3rd Infantry Division that came up from the south and went into Baghdad. And were war correspondents, and hats off to them. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, they were not injured.
Alan Fern, I wonder if I could hear from each of you the answer to an issue you raised several times this afternoon, and that is that the public has to judge about news, about the quality of news, about the differentiation between news and features, et cetera, et cetera. What would you suggest as a way to make the public better judges of this kind of thing?
You want me to go first or second? Listen, there's no easy answer, but let me give you one specific thing that I would like everybody to think about whenever they watch. I'll deal with television news right now, but it applies in the context. I'd like everybody to ask themselves, is that a fact they're reporting? Is that something they vetted and they think they know is true? Or are they telling me something that no one could know is true? Or that they want to be true? Or they think I want to be true? Because
how will you bring them to that point of asking the question?
And then writing a book and going and talking to all of you. But seriously, I mean, I'm not quite on a mission, but I sort of am on a mission. I would really like people to take a bit more responsibility themselves and ask themselves some tough questions. Because in this new day and age, as I said, we all have to be our own editors. And I do this now when I watch. I think to myself, well, wait a second, do they know that's true? Have they vetted that? What makes me believe that they're telling me the truth, as opposed to now they're spinning it, or they're trying to make it a little more racy for me or whatever. So that's one thing I'd like people to do.
I think the best way to do it is to buy this book, read this book, and the book is for sale by Politics and Prose right out there, and David will sign it for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Perfect. Good.